All right. Welcome to the second in a series of dialogues, joined today once again by Flowers or Love Some Flowers. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me with this discussion.
Always a pleasure to be with you, Chad. Yep.
Yeah, I really enjoyed our last talk, and apologies once again to you and the audience for recording in a very loud cafe in India. But today, here in the house, where hopefully there's no noise issues on my end, and definitely enjoyed what we talked about last time, and I was looking forward to getting back into some of the things that you and I are particularly interested in, like where the technological innovation, so-called, is actually taking us. And you and I actually both read a book to prepare for this discussion, Retrotopia by John Michael Greer. And I guess I just wanted to start by asking you your general view of that book. Like, what was your sort of general sense that you got from that book?
I have to say this was a really, really exciting read. I usually, here's my copy here. I usually mark books that I read with, pen and paper, and I mark all over the place. But this one, I decided not to do that because it's worth giving to another person to read. It's really his ideas about technology, his critique of it, is really, really unique. And so it's really worth thinking about. And his sense of what, how we could use the past to rethink our current situation and try to imagine what is a possibility for how we could organize ourselves politically and socially is really important. And so it's a book that's, it's not perfect. We could make a critique about, utopian thinking and all of that stuff, but it's a way of showing what's possible if we try to step outside the current, the current narrow spectrum of thought that's available to us.
Yeah, and ironically enough, it's not actually a Ted Kaczynski style critique of technology. This is not a rejection of technology. The biggest difference that I've noticed about John Michael Greer and Ted Kaczynski is that for Kaczynski, technology really is one thing. And that's why Ted Kaczynski repeatedly says, you have to get rid of all of it. He says, don't play this game of trusting that technology because it's useful to you and letting, the rest of the system stay intact enough to continue making things worse. You would just have to get rid of all of it. But for John Michael Greer, it's not a matter of getting rid of technology as just one thing, because for him, technology is not one thing. It's a number of different things, some of which maybe are more useful than others, some of which are more viable than others. One of the big themes of this book is that some of the things we take for granted now are simply not viable technologies. We don't have the fossil fuels to keep them running, but that doesn't mean that we go back to being hunters and gatherers. We can actually maintain maybe a more comfortable lifestyle if we go back to technologies from even like the early 1900s, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think the main difference, I think you've used the word teleology before to describe, like the different approaches to technology. I think for Greer, it's technology. There is no singular monolithic thing called technology. There, as you said, technologies, and each technologies can embody the teleology of particular instances of technology can embody, the intentions of their human creators. Whereas for Kaczynski, technology as this monolithic thing has a teleology that's beyond rational control. It's, once you set it into motion, there are all kinds of variables. In fact, it basically gains its own inertia, and it has a direction that's not perfectly in line with that may not coincide with the creator's original intentions.
Right, and once it gets going, nobody can actually control where it goes. One of the big arguments in his more recent work, which he wanted to publish while he still was alive, I guess, although he's still working on much bigger work. He published a section of it in like 2016 as Anti-Tech Revolution, and he said that even if you're president of the United States, you can't really control where society as a whole is going. It just slips out of the reach of anybody, even the president of the United States, to control where it's going. Because, like you mentioned, there is a certain movement that technology, in Kaczynski's sense of the word, takes once it gets moving. But I mean, I think that John Michael Greer would consider that to be an equivocation between two different kinds of technology. You have tools and then you have prosthetics. And John Michael Greer's understanding, you have things that maybe replace human capabilities, like computers can crunch numbers so you don't have to if you're using a calculator. It's so that you don't have to do the number crunching work. But there's other technologies that don't replace your capabilities as a human. They actually just extend them. He calls those tools. Nobody would argue that an axe for splitting wood is replacing the work that you have to do. You still have to do the work to split that wood. It merely allows you to extend your ability. And that's a distinction which not only Kaczynski, admittedly, but really all of us have lost track of. When we talk about technology, we really only mean things that replace our abilities, not realizing that it's perfectly legitimate to call all of these other tools also technologies. John Michael Greer's notion that even a stone axe from the Stone Age is technology. So it's something which enables us maybe to think more productively about the situation, because there are a number of technologies out there which are actually beneficial to us. They may actually help us grow. And I think that Retrotopia is a vision of what a society filled with those types of technologies would be like, right?
Yeah, and I think Kaczynski does make a distinction between, so against, he does talk about, technological autonomy, but he also makes a distinction between small scale technologies and organization. He calls it organization dependent technologies. And so that's kind of what his ideal situation is, of course, no technology, but he does make a distinction between small scale technologies that don't imply a huge sprawling infrastructure and then large scale organization. That's the particular term that he uses, is organization dependent technologies, which do imply not just an infrastructure, but all the things that come with it. So a division of labor, specialization, and so all those things, and resource extraction, etc. Yeah.
Right, it's gotten to the point now where, ironically enough, things that would have been considered to be small-scale technologies, like an axe for splitting wood, you have to actually go to Home Depot now to get that. And if you get one, it's going to be a very poorly made little $20 axe that they imported from a factory in Taiwan, and it'll break down after a couple of years. And it's one of those things where even if you want to use hand tools and do things yourself, you still have to go through these huge corporations like Home Depot and these huge factories in China. And it's just one of those strange sense of which we've actually lost this distinction. I think that if we really want to reclaim those older technologies that people used to use for self-sufficiency, we're actually just going to have to go outside of the Home Depot model. We have to bring back craftsmen and craftswomen who can actually build these things locally without a brand name attached, without the intermediation of financing for a Home Depot scale company, right?
Yeah, because again, to go back to that term teleology, the teleology of like a Stone Age axe is basically, well, or another way of putting it would be, what it implies is basically the competence of one person and of one locally sourced resource, right? Whereas an industrial hammer implies so much more than that. And so,
Right,
Okay.
and it also requires an enormous amount of unnecessary fossil fuels to get it to you at that Home Depot. Because, like, I remember buying tools at Home Depot in Colorado that were shipped all the way from Taiwan. You don't need to ship an axe halfway across the world to use it to split wood to go into your wood burner. So we did for thousands of years with a much shorter supply route than that.
Yeah, and with creating more durable products and products of more quality than what you can get from Home Depot. So.
Oh, very much so. Yeah, I think that a lot of the tools at Home Depot are just ornamental. I mean that very seriously. It looks like a tool, but it's not. You know, it's something you get just to I don't know, put in your shop to make it look pretty, but it's not going to actually do the job. I remember trying to do woodworking with these crappy Home Depot like $15 axes. You know, the teeth will wither within a couple of weeks. So that's the difficulty, is even if you want to go back, you can't do that while going through these channels. I remember the seeds from Home Depots, they suddenly either don't sprout, or if they do make it through one cycle, they don't produce viable seeds for the future. You can't reproduce them because they've literally engineered sterile plants. And that's troubling enough for like a hobbyist, quite frankly, who's just digging around in their backyard. But that's actually how we conduct agriculture on the grand scale in America now. Is our corn and soybeans are sterile because Monsanto sells a patented genome for cash to these farmers, so they can't be self-sufficient. And that's maybe good business sense in the short term for Monsanto. It's going to be literally death sentence for a lot of people when something goes wrong with that.
Yeah, and that's the other aspect of it, right? An industrially manufactured tool, it doesn't just embody like the intention of one person who's trying to solve a particular problem. It's also a whole market system that's implied by it. And so yeah, it's profit and marketing and advertising. It's a whole system of built around that tool. That's not just about using it toward a particular practical end.
Right, and it's actually kind of gotten away from what tools originally were supposed to be. Now, this is one way of looking at it, which a viewer actually mentioned during a live stream, which I had back in like June, which I deleted on accident. Unfortunately, it's been lost. But there's a viewer, I think, in Finland who I was talking about tools, and I was talking about books. For some reason, I was on those two topics in one video. Typical, I guess, live stream for me, getting on lots of different things. But I was talking about books because John Michael Greer mentioned in one of his blog posts that philosophy is what you get when you as a society reach a certain milestone, which archaeologists have wondered, why is it that philosophy sort of appears in the ancient Greeks at about the same time it appears in India, and about the same time it appears in China? This has been a big archaeological problem, and they finally pinned it down to philosophy is what you get when illiteracy expands beyond the official scribe class. So if literacy is merely the tool of the professional scribe, it's going to be used for very boring official like bookkeeping purposes. So the earliest stone tablets in like Sumeria are really boring to read because they're like receipts on business transactions. There was one archaeology student at like Columbia University who said he spent a whole year trying to decipher an ancient stone tablet, which was literally just a tax receipt. And it was like the most boring document you could imagine, but it was something that they had to study on like archaeological grounds because it was, from an era where that was all you had in writing. And if you have a professional scribe class, they're going to be dealing with like tax receipts and stuff like that. But when literacy expands to the general populace, not even maybe the general populace, just outside the scribe class, and you have the notion of liberal arts in ancient Greece of these are subjects fit to be studied by people who are not slaves. Most people don't know that's what liberal arts literally means, is people who are free, meaning this is education for someone who's not a slave. Okay, like philosophy and language and literature and poetry and things like that. If you get that sort of expansion of literacy to the free man rather than just the professional scribe, you suddenly get the ability for people to use writing not just to mark down like tax quantities and things like that, but also to mark down their thoughts. And if you have somebody's thoughts written in a text that then somebody else reads, let's just say you're engaged for hours reading a text by Aristotle or Kant or somebody like that, you're going to be thinking the thoughts of Kant. And if you do it long enough, you're going to start thinking like him. I've noticed myself, if I read enough Zizek, I start hearing the Zizekian critiques, running in my head, because I'm thinking not just his thoughts, I'm thinking like him. I'm thinking the same kind of thoughts as him. And that's what you get with writing that allows philosophy as not just thinking people's thoughts, but thinking about thought. This is the emergence of a study about thought in itself. Okay, you have the great thinkers like Plato and Aristotle laying down the ultimate foundation of thought. For Plato, that's the forms. For Aristotle, it's like the first principles, whatever it is. They're thinking about thinking. And the reason I bring this up is one of my viewers from Finland or someplace said, well, maybe tools do that too, but they don't let you think someone else's thoughts. They let you get into somebody else's body, because a tool is supposed to be used in only one particular way. If you have a tool like an axe that you use wrong, you're going to get hurt, maybe badly. And you can only really use a tool if you get into the body of the person who was intending for it to be used in a certain way. A lot of apprenticeship, I think, is that. Formal education is passing down thought forms to other minds. I think apprenticeship is just passing down body forms to other bodies. And that's what gets lost when you move from technology as tools, which are meant to be used, which are meant to have your body become basically in the place of somebody else's body, which is really a freeing thing. Ted Kaczynski talks about technology takes away our freedom. I would argue that no, using a tool actually frees you quite a bit. Kind of like playing an instrument. We're both musicians. You're a much better musician than I, of course, but we're both musicians, and you can't play an instrument without putting your body into the way that other musicians have had it. Okay, you can tell someone who's just starting on an instrument if they don't have the body in the right position, right, to do it. And I think that tools in that sense are free. Music does free you if you're engaged in playing it. It's not something that takes your freedom if you're engaged in like jamming on the guitar for a while. So I think that that's one thing which we can look at with the distinction between like small scale technologies that maybe are meant to free you precisely by putting your body into that position, versus a lot of our modern technologies are not meant to do that. They're simply meant to put you in a completely passive state where you push a button and you sit back and it's done for you, right?
Yeah, and actually, I wanted to like preface this whole discussion about Greer and Retrotopia by kind of, connecting it back to our earlier discussions about the difference between, science or technology. We mentioned like linear versus divergent thinking. Kind of think about this in terms of a larger conversation about what the value of literature is, and what the value of approaching ideas through a narrative is, as opposed to writing like a straightforward manifesto, and also thinking about these issues as. So basically, yeah, I wanted to like revisit some of the comments that we exchanged a few months ago about the value of reading fiction in a philosophical way. And the way that you put it was, extracting a philosophy from a fictional work rather than applying one. And so if I could just read a comment that you left on one of my videos, you said, I'm not against reading texts philosophically, but I do think that in a certain sense, a really great literary work has its own philosophy that can be extracted from it rather than an exterior one that would be brought to it. And in one sense, it's more difficult to extract a philosophy from a literary work than from a philosophical work. And then I responded by saying, yes, there's a big difference between doing a refined philosophical reading versus merely trying to lock a text into a ready-made framework. And for sure, approaching ideas indirectly, obliquely, by playing them out through a narrative can be more fruitful than writing a straightforward manifesto. So, yeah, again, I wanted to couch this discussion into a larger conversation about the value of about learning philosophical lessons from a work of fiction, and because I think the value of literature, I think is increasingly becoming an open question. It's already thought of more as like a leisurely activity than as a source of insight into human affairs. And again, to create some continuity between our last discussion about science and technology, or like, knowledge versus wisdom, linear versus divergent, philosophy versus dogmatic science, maybe in the course of these discussions, we can think about what literature offers that is different from other human endeavors and other disciplines, and maybe talk about some of the ways that in which it's similar.
Yeah, I think one thing, that, I would ask you right now is, what do you think was gained by having Retrotopia as a story about, this is actually 2 weeks in the city of Toledo, Ohio in the year 2065, rather than laying out like a sociological treatise saying, current technological trends are unable to continue, but it's likely that in the year 2065 in Toledo, Ohio, we can, with this much certainty, predict that these technologies might be in use. Like you could do that. You could do like a sociological paper laying out the objective reasons why this future is likely. But what did you gain? Yeah, by having a story with characters and events and emotions and all that.
Yeah. So, I think both, right? Both sociology and literature, I think so literature also is dealing with models. Fictional literature is also dealing with, it's basically allowing the author to model how certain ideas would play out over time in a narrative. And really creating a fictional world is ultimately about, basically selectively recreating reality according to certain value judgments about your own present and about the past. And it allows you to relativize your own culture or another culture and achieve a kind of objective distance from it, from which you can then reevaluate the present and the past. And so it's not the kind of objective distance that you supposedly have in the sciences, but I think we should be skeptical about the idea that we can simply run experiments or use statistical research or use computer simulations to deal with societal issues. I think we have to go about it in the way that literature does, which is by forcing you to imagine and immerse yourself in the author's model. And I think that's what's unique about exploring, say, technology through narrative fiction rather than running a sociological, using statistical research and then creating a sociological model, because you don't get the opportunity to really imagine and actually immerse yourself in the author's model. I think fiction is far better equipped to handle the complexity of human affairs than science is. And I think we should be skeptical about this idea that we'll eventually, be able to enter a handful of variables. Sociology is basically doing the same thing. It's creating models, but it's saying that, I guess where we're headed is that we're going to be able to just basically enter a handful of variables into a computer, and then run a simulation, and then arrive at clear answers to extremely difficult questions dealing with human affairs. And I mean, but that only works if you accept, basically omitting a near infinite amount of other variables that we may choose from. And it's only objective in the sense of omitting like subjective judgments after an initial human input of, a very small and very limited number of factors. Whereas in fiction, the author is making all of these subjective value judgments, and he's not trying to obscure that through a supposedly objective method or an objective system. I don't know if that made any sense, but
yeah, absolutely. The idea that we've just got to invest more money in having the right algorithm so that we can get the result we want, which in the case of like economics, that's just more prosperity. Well, it would be bad enough if the kind of modeling that you mentioned was merely theoretical. It's just a bunch of, professors at a research institution, writing monographs in academic journals and things like that. But really, we've taken it to a much more serious level. We have paid experts at the level of economists who are not just running these simulations because they want to graph the data, but they're actually running the economy, and they're running it into the ground because they have their fancy models, which they apply at the level of our whole economy with money printing and the stock market and where the investments go within the nation. And the results have been disastrous, and these are some of the best number crunchers really in the country. A professional economist, they recruit some of the best number crunching minds in the country. When my sister was at Yale, she said something like 1 out of every 4 Yale students declares economics as their major. So certainly the problem is not that we don't have smart enough people doing it. The problem is not that they haven't been paid enough, or we haven't been at it long enough. It's simply a question of whether that's what you should be doing in the first place. And I really agree with you that, the problem is not making a more complicated model. The problem is maybe just getting back to something much simpler. And it's hard to think of anything simpler than a story, because stories are things which, they hypothesized that they told stories around the campfire in hunter-gatherer days in the Stone Age to pass the time or to connect with each other, or just because that's what you do when you have something happen. You tell the story. Like I told you when we were, even before on camera today, that, yesterday or the other night, I got up at 1 a.m. and I was putting away the potatoes and I see a rat jump through the window of the house. That's a story I've told to, everybody who would listen, because it's a pretty freaky story, right? So, I mean, we tell stories not even when there's necessarily a reason to do it, which is just natural. Like if you're in a minor car accident, what are you going to do? You're going to take out your phone and you're going to tell everybody, And I think that getting back to telling stories is not an example of trying to make things more complicated. It's rather getting back to something very, very simple, but something which makes us all human, right?
Yeah, and that's what's valuable about all the examples that Greer includes in this novel is, he's describing technology and that's very similar to what we have today, and he describes all of the problems that we're already facing or that we're going to be facing in the near future. But so to respond to that question, but he's using a different setting, and it's interesting, like he replaces much of what we already have, which we can already identify with terms like, so he replaces the internet with MetaNet, and he replaces tablets with VPad. And so it's interesting, even that small, very minor thing, replacing things that we already have today with like these neologisms, that immediately has like a self-distancing effect. You all of a sudden you get you get the chance to step outside of your own culture and relativize your own surroundings. And I think that's how we should think about objectivity and gaining an objective distance, rather than what goes on in in sociology, where you would just describe. You can't achieve that by running with a sociological description saying, we have the internet and this is the problems that it causes.
Right, because it's too familiar. Because we all have views about the internet. I mean, there was a study in America a year ago, before I left the country, asking in a survey, what is the one thing you would not give up even if you couldn't afford it? And like number 10 on the list was alcohol, and then like I'm sure cigarettes was somewhere on that list as a former pack-a-day smoker myself. But number 1 was the internet. Number 1 in the country. People said the thing they would not give up, even if they could not afford it, was the internet. And we have this emotional attachment to the internet. If you remember the South Park episode where the internet disappears and there's a rumor that there's internet in California. So there's masses of people on foot walking from Colorado to California because they heard a rumor that there's internet there. It's satire, but it's too close to the truth, because we all do have that emotional attachment to internet, but we don't have that emotional attachment to metanet. And like you said, it creates this distance where we can think objectively about it. It's kind of like, I don't know if you've heard of the Nasarima article in Culture and Anthropology.
Yes. That's one of the actually that I wrote that down as one of the themes that I wanted to discuss with you. Is that's the idea of cultural relativism, right? Do you want to summarize that article a little bit?
Yeah, it's been like 11 years. That was like the first article I read in college, I think, because I took cultural anthropology the first semester, and that was the first reading.
That's the first article that I read in cultural anthropology as well, yeah.
Right. So, I think some things are pretty standardized across the United States. But I remember reading it about there's a tribe. Okay, there's a tribe with a unique culture who are situated, there's a general region. There's like a prairie south of Canada. Okay, they're based somewhere around there. Okay, and they have very bizarre rituals. For example, they have a founding figure who there's a myth about him being someone who cut down trees. He cut down a tree, and they have really strange rituals. Like if somebody is sick, no matter how sick they are, if they don't have money, they won't be admitted into the healing place. They'll just be left to die. And you have these rituals involving chemicals, which you apply to your body, but even your wife can't watch you while you're in this space that's been set aside in the house for applying those chemicals and doing other rituals that are very personal with your body. And did you want to say anything more? Those are like the only things I can remember from like 11 years ago. You could tell the audience a bit more about the Nasarima.
No, that pretty much sums it up. I think the point of that article was that, if you use, I guess two things, right? So it's saying that if you used like the specialized language of one culture to understand, a foreign culture, instead of trying to understand a culture first according to its own terms, then you're going to get a distorted or incomplete picture of the culture that you're studying. But so there's that one point, and then the other point is that once you know that this article, talking about this exotic tribe is actually just talking about American culture, and so like
we're the ones with hospitals that don't admit people without insurance. We're the ones with bathrooms where you have all of these rituals that, involve strange chemicals that you bought from Walgreens, and nobody can be in there while you're in there, right? And those are strange cultural habits, right? I mean, if you think about them objectively, it is kind of strange the way that we do things in America, right?
Yeah, and so that article kind of teaches you two lessons, right? It teaches you that lesson about not using one culture's lens to understand another culture, saying that, every cultural practice is best understood within the context of its home culture. And then the other thing that it creates is like that self-distancing effect. Once you know that, oh, this is just talking about American culture, you immediately have this. You get to step outside of your own culture, and think about it more objectively.
I think that. Yeah, I think maybe you and I also have the experience of living outside the United States. We both actually got to live in South Asia. I currently am living in India, and you lived in Nepal as well. So I think that you and I maybe also have a sense of, I mean, if you've only ever lived in one part of America, especially, like I lived only in Colorado for the first 25 years of my life. It's very hard to gain any distance from the way things are done. Even just within Colorado for me. Like I used to think that, going to Illinois was a huge change from Colorado, although there's remarkably little difference between the way any part of America is from another. But, if you've lived outside America, you have a very different sense about how weird most of the customs there are. I mean, and you got to live in France too, right?
Yeah. I've lived in, I did an exchange program, so I was in France for a year, and I was born in Nepal, and I left when I was 6. So I do have some pretty vivid memories of Nepal as well, and some strong ties to that country, and so that travel affords you that distance as well, and that's exactly what happens in Retrotopia. So Peter Carr is that's the protagonist of the story. He's an emissary of actually, did we even give a summary of Retrotopia? Do you want me to do that?
Oh, yeah, that would be great. In typical, Chad fashion, I remember trying to discuss this with Alan Lee. It was 50 minutes into the discussion before we actually got around to it. So sorry about that. That's just
it's so full of great ideas. You just kind of want to jump into it instead of spending time on the summary. But I think it'll be important for the viewers. So basically, the story takes place about 50 years from now in a future where the U.S. endures a second civil war a few decades earlier, and so the United States is partitioned into several smaller independent states. And so much of the middle Atlantic region around New York becomes the Atlantic Republic, which is where the protagonist comes from. And then there's the Republic of New England above, in the territories above the Atlantic. And then in the South, you have Texas, which becomes its own state. You have the Confederate States of America, which is, comprises most of the states in the South. Then you have in the central Midwest, the Republic of Missouri. And then in the upper Midwest, the Lakeland Republic. And so the main character, Peter Carr, he's an emissary of the Atlantic Republic who takes a train to the Lakeland Republic as a special envoy in order to gain a better understanding of the country. And the Lakeland Republic is, it's the outlier. It's the outlier among these newly formed nations in that it's not as advanced, and it's been relatively isolated from the other nations, due to trade embargoes and closed borders. So the story really is centering around Peter's personal transformation more than anything, as he tries to make sense of the ways that, life is organized in this foreign country. So it's about his internal struggle to respond to the challenge that Lakeland poses to his basic assumptions about the proper way to organize society, as someone who's used to living in a advanced industrial society, and also as someone who with a position in the newly elected government of his country. So it's someone with more privileged access to information about the way things are than what the general public has available through the media. And so, so to return to that, theme of cultural relativism, when he gets on the train, he immediately starts to judge all the people that he encounters. He sees their antiquated dress, their quaint ways, and he's completely shocked to discover a couple that is voluntarily immigrating from his republic, the Atlantic Republic, to this backwards place in the upper Midwest. And so all of the prejudices and the biases that he has are, that's exactly our relation to the past, and that's our relation to the third world. We've been talking about things that are unthinkable in this society. Your own experience, as someone who left the United States to go live in the quote unquote third world, is a perfect illustration of that. And our understanding of other places is largely built up through media consumption rather than firsthand observation or experience, or even an understanding that's built through relationships, through direct interaction with people. And so, like Peter Carr, this envoy, he loses his access to the metanet, the internet, and his gadgets become useless. And so he loses the recourse to statistical info, and he can't make sense of cultural info by just looking it up on, I guess, whatever the equivalent of Wikipedia is in that future. And like even simple number crunching, all of the discourse of his culture is removed, and he's really forced to consider Lakeland on its own terms. And
and what he finds there is not so much totally new stuff no one's ever done. He actually just finds them having the sense to use things which we knew in the early 1900s, we knew in the late 1800s that they worked. We knew at that time that there was no need to replace them with these shoddily made, in most cases, plastic trash equivalents of what was actually a pretty sturdy and reliable technology before. I mean, we had this bizarre transition where marketing became the main place where funds were invested with new technologies, because you could spend like 80% of the product's price just goes into marketing, because they realize if they convince you to buy a plastic piece of trash which is going to break down, because they marketed it with some celebrity, like Michael Jordan appeared on the cover or something like that, it didn't matter that it was a piece of plastic trash. They could still get you to buy it, and especially when there was no other alternative. We mentioned earlier in this podcast that at this point, if you want to get your own tools outside the Home Depot model, it's very hard. You have to basically go to an antique store, and or make your own. Yeah, but that leads to the problem of recursion, where in order to make your own, you need the tools to make your own, and it's one of those problems which is going to become more than just like theoretical in the future of America, especially is there's going to be a legitimate shortage of vital farming and manufacturing tools. The supply chains from China are not going to last forever either. So it's going to be a huge problem. But I mean, as far as Retrotopia goes, I feel a little bit like I'm already living in something like Retrotopia, not quite as far maybe as, the Lakeland Republic goes in 2065. But, I finished the book this morning, and I was underlining all the things which it's like, no, that's what India is already doing. He talks about how, rather than have the one suburban mall, like in suburban Denver, you've got the mall in the western suburbs, and then you have the mall in the northern suburbs, and you have the mall in the southern suburbs, and then you have the mall in the eastern suburbs, and that mall basically services the whole western part of the metropolitan area, which is a huge area. So you're going to drive all the way to that mall if you want to get clothing or something, and you've got the Walmart that services that whole suburb, and it's one of those things where you have to drive extraordinary amounts of time on the interstate to get to this huge parking lot, to get into this huge impersonal store to get crappily made stuff from China. And in contrast, in Lakeland Republic, you don't have just one huge mall in a suburban sprawl of an area. You have little shops within walking distance. And I'm like, yeah, that's India. You know, this alley that leads from the house I'm in now to the main road, which is like a dirt road alley, which is very narrow, has a hair salon. We have a banana stand. We have a newspaper stand. You know, we've got at the other side of that a fruit stand and a bakery. And, you know, we have what we need just within this alley. And the thing that I love about India is, you know, there's not just one vegetable stand where if they don't have what you're looking for, you're SOL. You know, if there's a number of vegetable stands where you might walk 3 doors over. Like me and my wife did this the other night. We were looking for potatoes, and the first vegetable stand didn't have them, but it didn't matter because we could walk three stalls over, and that one had them. And there's just an incredible amount of diversity at the level of business in India, which you probably remember from Nepal as well, which is simply doesn't exist in America. All you have is Walmart, right?
Yeah, and I guess that's probably the most interesting thing about Greer's vision is the variety in terms of like all the different configurations that you can imagine. You know, like, so the main thing that he has to contend with the protagonist, Peter Carr, is what really separates the Lakeland Republic from the other republics is that they have this tiered system of municipal organizations. So basically each county votes to be in one of 5 tiers, which are distinguished by their level of infrastructure. And so the lower the tier, the lower your taxes and the lower the level of infrastructure. So in tier 1, you have the bare minimum of infrastructure with, you know, just the police, fire departments, and dirt roads. Basically the level of infrastructure of the U.S. in the 1830s. And then then tier 2 is 30 years later, 1860, tier 3, 1890, tier 4, 1920, and then tier 5 is 1950. And so in the highest tier, you have cars, you have paved roads, household phones, electricity, and also the highest taxes.
Right, and, because somebody has to pay for all this stuff. That's what we don't think about in America, but somebody has to pay for all of this.
Yeah, exactly. And so all of these different configurations are built around the founding principle that's also enshrined in the Republic's Constitution, which is that no one's technology gets a subsidy. So if you want it, you can pay. You have to pay for it either out of your pocket, or you have to shift to another county with a different tier.
Right, and it's one of those things where like now you live in New York City, but I grew up in a pretty rural part of Southern Colorado, really just out in the desert, and I certainly remember going to people's houses way up in the hills or way up in the mountains. Okay, very far away from anything like a city, but every one of those houses still had all of the access to any level of technology that you would find in the city. And we've expanded this one technological model and infrastructural model all the way deep into the hills and deep into the desert temporarily, but it won't last because in a certain sense, we can't afford to have that level of investment into infrastructure for the entire country indefinitely. There's going to come a point where the outlying desert and mountain and rural regions they're already starting to be cut off, and that a lot of those are already going back to dirt roads, right?
Yeah, and that's the problem of that's one of the themes that he explores in the book is like, so for instance, with respect to efficiency, right? So one of the things, the recurring themes about in the book is that instead of thinking about efficiency contextually, in practical situations, like what does efficiency mean in the desert? What does it mean in Colorado versus New York? Or, we want to basically elevate efficiency into a principle that applies to every situation. So, like whenever Peter, he dismisses the farming techniques and the business practices of Lakeland as being hopelessly inefficient, the locals respond by simply asking him, well, efficiency in terms of what output given what input, which is
right. And efficiency, we always talk about efficiency being the only standard, but efficiency is really not. It's a liability as much as it is a benefit in the short term, because efficient literally means something that is running at near capacity all the time, for which if it goes a short period of time without maximal inputs, it breaks down. That's what efficiency actually means. And the opposite of efficiency is resilience. If you want an example from nature, a hummingbird is very efficient. But if it goes a short period of time with no food, it's dead. On the contrary, a house cat is very resilient. It's not an efficient animal. It sleeps over 12 hours a day. Okay, a cat hunts very little of the time, whereas a hummingbird is active all the time. A cat is very resilient. It can go through periods without having food all the time at a much more a much longer period of less than ideal inputs than a hummingbird. And we've built a society that has taken efficiency to an absurd level. If we were to go a couple days without maximal inputs of fossil fuels or maximal inputs of debt, another thing that we're running exorbitant levels of debt just to keep global trade going, our society would break down. We do not have a resilient society. And yet the answer that everybody has is to make society more efficient, right?
Yeah, and that's a great point, is that, making an appeal to efficiency as a higher principle is a way of like obscuring the concrete conditions and practical considerations of any given context. And that is a very, very important point about efficiency versus resilience, because when efficiency takes on the status of this higher principle, it really becomes impossible to think in terms of not just economic opportunity costs, but also the trade-off in terms of values, right? So we can't think about whether efficiency is more valuable than independence or resilience. And one of the examples given in the story to highlight this trade-off between efficiency and resilience, and also between efficiency and independence, is the failure of satellites and the impact that has on the economy. So like much of modern communication, instant communication is dependent on satellite infrastructure, meaning that much of the economy is dependent on satellite communication infrastructure. So
right. In fact, I recall in like 2012, if you ask people in early 2012, so what exactly is the 2012 apocalypse? One guy said to me that the satellites are going to stop functioning. And it sounds like a joke to say that satellites stopping functioning is enough to cause an apocalypse. But if you really think about it, it's actually about to that point now where if we went without satellite communication for one day, how much of the global economy would be able to function?
Yeah, exactly. And then the other point is that, so like when one of the satellites in mid-range orbit, over the Earth fails in this story, it breaks apart and it starts taking out all the other satellites. So you have this unpredictable cascading effect that threatens to jeopardize the whole economy. And so when you're over reliant on this vast interconnected network, it's going to leave you much more vulnerable to a destabilizing attack, because the failure of one sector, one mode, is going to have a ripple effect or a domino effect on everything else. And so if you just think in terms of efficiency and satellites give you instant international communication, you're not going to focus on, you're not going to try to model what happens when they go wrong. And it's going to lead to some very myopic assessments about, problems.
Right, and the response is always going to be, let's just tone it up another level to catch up with them. So let me put it this way, if the problem's getting bigger, the response is always, well, we just need to get ahead of the problem by investing more to try to make it more complicated. I remember a couple of days ago, the CEO of Twitter came to India, and he responded to the allegations by some in India that he was not doing enough to stop the abuse of Twitter by people in India for things like using anonymous accounts to incite violence in certain politically heated areas. There were trolling accounts on Twitter literally calling for violence in certain areas. And, the response from Twitter was, we do our best to cut abuse, but it's like a box which, no matter how good a lock you buy, there's always going to be somebody who comes along and has a key that can unlock it. And his response was, we always just have to invest more in making fancier and fancier locks, because there's always going to be fancier and fancier keys. To which I say, at what point do you simply stop trying to get ahead of a problem that's getting bigger and bigger and bigger? And honestly, that's small compared to, people trolling on Twitter. That's small compared to the kind of problem you just mentioned with satellites falling into the Kessler phenomenon. Where,
syndrome.
That's right, yeah. Where you have exceeded the capacity of how many satellites would fit in that orbital range, and then it leads to you, at the end, having none. Okay, and right, and a big problem like that, if you were to tell most people, they would say, well, the response is we just have to get bigger in our response. We have to invest more in this or that sophisticated response. Whereas the solution might actually just be to get simpler, right?
Yeah, and so instead of rethinking the whole model, we're just hung up on trying to solve a problem by adding exception over exception after exception. I think the term that you used that I really liked was Ptolemization. So instead of rethinking the underlying principles and values that any particular instance of technology embodies, we just want to add exception after exception to it.
Right, and at some point, you're simply going to lose that game, because the bigger it gets, the problem that is, there's going to come a point where you don't have the resources to catch up to it. And I think that trolls on Twitter are a small example of this in comparison with the climate problem, because if your problem is something like rain not falling in much of the United States, which is not hyperbole, or it's not science fiction, much of California is on fire as we speak, right?
Yeah, and the aquifers in the Midwest are drying up, and there's no rain, so we're going to have a Dust Bowl situation there. Oh yeah, I mean, I grew up in southern Colorado, which is desert, and I remember southern Colorado being pretty rainy and pretty green in the 90s, and then 2002 there was a monumental drought where my teacher's house caught fire and burned down in the forest, and a lot of people in Colorado they've lost their house in the forest because it seemed like a good idea at the time to build it where it's pretty, but forest fires are going to take 1/3, is what I heard. 1/3 of the forest in the United States West is going to be lost that way. But it's one of those things where the aquifer that you mentioned in western Kansas, for example, is something which I was driving out of Colorado to Oklahoma a couple years ago. Western Kansas is something which, if there's an agricultural field, like a hay field for industrial purposes, it's green. But right across the road, it's desert. And they're literally turning desert into oasis by pumping a limited aquifer. And once that water's gone, the oasis is all going to be gone. That's pretty frightening.
Right, because they're not just growing ornamental stuff that's pretty. That's food. Okay, so a lot of the food that feeds this country is coming from a region that's actually desert. And that's what's kind of worrying about it. It's going to be a very big problem pretty soon.
Yeah, and much of it is also coming from California. So much of our produce comes from California, and the interesting thing is that in if you look at the map in the beginning of this book, California is not even on the map. It's not even mentioned. It's just constantly in turmoil. It's constantly dealing with its own civil war, and so it's a lot less stable than the rest of the United States. I think that's pretty telling. That's
Well,
it's
yeah, I
interesting.
mean, you used to live in the Bay Area, is that right?
Yeah. So for about, I think, 8 months, I lived in Oakland. Yeah.
Oh well, yeah. I knew another guy who he was also a New Yorker. Okay, he was from Brooklyn, but he lived in San Francisco or somewhere around there. He said that it was so expensive that he lived on potatoes. And this is a guy from New York City, which I consider to be damned expensive when I was there, which I have been. But he was saying like the Bay Area is just a whole nother level of expensive, right?
That's exactly why I moved back to New York. It's actually more expensive there than here, and it's the public transportation system is less extensive. It's more convenient to be in New York City than in the Bay Area. So I live right across from San Francisco. Yeah.
Oh, that's totally believable, really. I mean, because I've been to San Francisco only for the airport, and even there, it was a nightmare. Like, I thought that the airport in Europe is a nightmare trying to get an affordable meal, but I mean, the San Francisco airport, there is no like fast food or something just for like a quick bite. It's all way overpriced food that caters to, quite frankly, that sort of, I gotta watch my words. I know who's watching. I don't want to insult, that area, but let's just say there's no budget option. Okay, even at the airport. And that's something which at the moment looks like prosperity. I did a video on Detroit back in like 2015 about how America's already starting the path to a third world country. And somebody shot back with, well, what about Silicon Valley? Like, things suck in Detroit, but in San Francisco, they're still making a lot of money. To which I say, yeah, they're making money temporarily at companies like Facebook, but not because they're actually making a profit. Mark Zuckerberg is gaming the system to sell us basically a worthless product as though it were gold, because all of the money for Facebook is coming from super inflated stock prices and lots of debt. Okay, so the unspoken fact about Mark Zuckerberg is, that Facebook was not really an original idea. There was an engineer who used to work at Facebook who did a truthful blog post about it. He said, look, there's been so many innovations that if you really wanted to build a Facebook clone, you could do it in 1 hour. Okay. It was not a uniquely innovative idea. It was not a uniquely impressive engineering feat. It was something which anybody could build a clone of. It was just something that was in the right place at the right time. And Mark Zuckerberg gamed the system to become a billionaire off of a company that has never made a profit. And he's doing it with, reserves of money which are completely fake, in the sense that the big loans which are given to his company, because it seems like a winning horse right now, it's money that we printed out of nowhere. And the stocks are being bought with money we print out of nowhere. And all of the wealth, I'm just trying to say, in San Francisco and the area right now, it's all fake. That's very controversial, but it's the truth. And when that game has run its course, you're going to see something that will make Detroit in the early 21st century look tame, right?
Yeah, that's not a future any of us are looking forward to. San Francisco, just to return to that for a little bit, the homelessness problem is so huge in San Francisco that they actually have programs to, they pay the bus tickets of homeless people and ship them out to other counties.
But the irony is that a lot of homeless people from other states will actually find a way to hitchhike to San Francisco because they hear that that's such a good place. That's one thing I've heard anyway, is if you're going to be homeless, you might as well do it in San Francisco, where they have more maybe benefits. Like they at least have some things that are given away to the homeless.
And the wealth is miles away.
Yeah, but I mean, at least that's what I've heard is like people are coming to San Francisco, maybe just based on the lie, but they're coming there to be homeless there, right?
Right. And then they're shipped away because San Francisco doesn't want them there. Yeah.
Right, and that's what we're going to deal with until we can get some affordable housing. Because, like I mentioned, my house in India is less than $50 a month to rent. Okay, it would be $2,000 a month to rent that same size house in Denver. I don't even want to think about what it would cost in California, or in like New Jersey around New York has absurdly overpriced housing too. I think, right?
Oh yeah, it's extremely expensive, and rent rates are just as high in Oakland and the Bay Area than as they are here in New York City. Maybe even more expensive in some places. Yeah.
Right. You can't even have a house. You cannot even have a house in much of America, Denver included. You cannot even have a house. And I had an interview with an Indian reporter today. It's on my channel, where I talked with him about the Indian perspective on the student loan story that he caught wind of. He's going to publish it in the Mirror for the UK. And, since he's an Indian, he had questions. Like he's saying, so you're saying housing is kind of expensive. It's like, yeah, housing is $500,000 in Denver, and we've been squeezed out of it in a way that I don't see in India. You can get a house here for $50 a month. You don't have to be like a doctor or lawyer to have access to a house in India. You could be somebody from maybe a more modest background, like somebody driving a tuk-tuk. You can still have a fairly nice house. I've been to a tuk-tuk driver's house here in India, and it's something which we've created a real estate bubble in America, which a small handful of people got extraordinarily wealthy off of, but we put so many people out of housing that it's going to be a political destabilizer. That even in a quote unquote third world, you simply do not see that problem, right?
Yeah, exactly. I was wondering if you wanted to switch gears a little bit and talk about maybe like the cultural aspects of Greer's Retrotopia. So I was thinking about the theme of how our culture, which is unified, our current culture, which is unified by technological infrastructure and
Actually,
characterized.
if you could just explain that to the audience. I'll just go ahead and grab that book from the room. I'll be right back. But just sort of, if you speak to the audience about that, I'll be right back.
Okay, so yeah, I want to explore the theme of culture unified by technology and a dependence on oil versus a society of varied subcultures that are united around certain cultural values and principles. So, because that's the kind of society that Greer imagines in the Lakeland Republic. And I was thinking about how all of the subcultural niches that we have today, rely on the fact that more and more of the world has been assimilated into global structures, global economic structures, technological infrastructure, and just on the internet, you have all of these niche trends. But you can only have them against really the background of a increasingly homogenous global culture that's unified by technology, and especially access to the internet. And all of these other ways of living, especially in the third world, are kind of precluded. It's not possible against this the current trends that are creeping into every corner of the world. And what's interesting about Greer is that, again, in Retrotopia, you have a vibrant multicultural society. And in some ways, you could say that he is a reactionary, that he has reactionary perspectives on modernity. But and I'm not saying that as a pejorative, really. I'm just saying he has a critical take on modernity, and he responds. He doesn't respond. He doesn't want to necessarily lament the fragmentation of culture into separate subcultures, and he's not wishing for a return to a more homogeneous culture and nations with strong national characters. He seems to be advocating for for a multicultural subcultural society that's unified loosely around specific cultural values and organizing principles, as opposed to a culture where you have a homogeneous global culture around technology and access to the internet, and then you have the illusion of variety because you have these subcultural niches. And I'm sorry for not being so clear, but I guess
I mean, you're right about the fact that sorry, I kind of misbegan what you said, but I mean, you're right that, the issue of culture is something which he's a lot more open-minded about than, he modeled this kind of as a response to a book from the 70s called Ecotopia, which I don't know if you're familiar with that book.
No.
I'm not either, in the sense I haven't read it because, I have many things more important to read than a admittedly kind of silly book called Ecotopia. But he does talk about it in one of his blog posts. When he finished Retrotopia, he did a blog post where he talked about why Retrotopia is kind of a play on words for a 1970s book called Ecotopia. Now, Ecotopia is kind of the green liberal fantasy of what the future is going to look like, where everybody's going to ride a bicycle to work because, nobody's going to drive cars. It's all going to be bikes with bike lanes. And I've lived in cities like Boulder where you have all the bike lanes, which actually don't stop that many people from driving cars, but it makes the city feel good about the fact that it has its bike lanes to prepare for the Ecotopia future. And the big thing about Ecotopia is that we also, in addition to using clean energy and riding bicycles, we also have a cultural change where everybody becomes the same culture. Now, that's not how they phrase it. They phrase it in this sort of, liberal jargon about, well, in the future, we don't have things like, religious fundamentalism, and we don't have bigotry, and we don't have narrow-mindedness, because everybody is basically just like a upper middle class liberal from Berkeley, California, is really what they mean when they say that. And, the fact of the matter is, you're never going to have some parts of the United States become the same culture as Berkeley. It's just not going to happen. You've lived in the South and you've lived in the North, just like I have. I've lived in Texas and I've lived in Illinois. And you're simply never going to have Oklahoma be filled with people with the same cultural and political leanings as somebody in Berkeley, California, or somebody in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And the idea that the only reason that everybody's not the same political and cultural values as in Berkeley, it's just they haven't been enlightened yet. The Ecotopia future is one in which everybody's been enlightened enough to where now everybody in the rural South is just like people in Berkeley. That's exactly what Greer chose not to do with this book. You don't have everybody progressed to one cultural view. You have cultural diversity. You have yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Yes, that's exactly what I see his project as trying to achieve. He's basically decoupling reactionary perspectives, and again, I'm not using that term in a pejorative sense, but reactionary perspectives on modernity from modern social sensibilities. So in the Lakeland Republic, you have gay marriage, you have atheist assemblies, you have alongside the Amish and other even more Luddite religious communities with even more Luddite tendencies. And so you have this vibrant, multicultural, multiracial society. You have consideration for the disabled, basically all the modern concerns of progressives and liberals, but in a society with 1950s infrastructure as the highest level of technological development. And I think that's a really, really, that's quite an achievement, because what he's saying, what I've never heard, this is a perspective I've never really encountered, is that social forms can be as varied as people's imaginations will allow. And reverting to previous ways of life doesn't necessarily mean the undoing of modern ethical sensibilities or modern intellectual developments. And like, one of the really interesting things is that, so in the Atlantic Republic that the protagonist is from, one of the main parties is the Dem Reps. And so which is basically, yeah, the Democrats and Republicans as one party. And
I mean, which even in our area, you could argue we have that, right?
Right, right. I mean, we're already there. He's just saying, let's just call it what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And so he contrasts the political problems in the Atlantic Republic, which is where the current system seems to be headed, with the political tension that you have in the Lakeland Republic between the two main parties are the conservatives and the restorationists, and they actually represent real cultural differences, because so the conservatives want to preserve that current tier system, and the restos want to basically roll things back even further. And so it's really interesting. He's really decoupled, reactionary perspectives on modernity from social sensibilities. And what allows for this is that people get to directly vote on infrastructure. And so that the tier system is basically what becomes possible if we think outside the narrow spectrum of political thought that we currently find ourselves trapped in.
Right, and I think that, once again, India kind of is like the Retrotopia that he mentions, because here we do have, I guess, a different set of technological, what's the word for it? I don't want to say we have a lower standard of living, because it's not that, okay? I've actually gotten a higher standard of living coming to India than I had when I was in America. When I left America, I was down to 100 pounds. I tried to sell my blood in Oklahoma City earlier this year, and they could not take my blood because I was under 110 pounds. So living on rice and beans, peanut butter jelly sandwiches, and oatmeal in a first world country, supposedly, I was a lower standard of living than I got coming to India. But the irony is I got a higher standard of living coming to a place with less energy wasting technology. That's really the word I think I was looking for just now. It's less energy wasting. The way that we do things in general here is less energy wasting. Even doing the dishes is different here. The dish soap here is dry dish soap, basically, which you don't run the water unless you're rinsing a dish. So the way that dishes are done in America is just outright wasteful in comparison, that most people use a dishwasher, which is this big, ugly machine that runs for an hour, wastes an extraordinary amount of water and electricity to wash something you could wash in like 10 minutes by hand. But in India,
and dry with the wind.
Exactly. Just leave it to dry overnight. It'll dry quick enough, especially if you're in a hot state in the south, and during the summertime. But the dish soap in India only functions if you're not running the water. This is what I had to find out through trial and error. Is it's meant to be used in a way that reduces water wasting, and it actually gives you a higher standard of living. And yet, it does not conform only to one ideology, because I see a lot more religious diversity in India than I ever saw in America, in the sense that, you could have the same basic sort of tea stall, and you have to look in the shop to see whether there's a Hindu icon, or whether there's a Buddhist icon and incense burning, or whether there's a picture of a Roman Catholic image of Jesus Christ, or whether there's something in Arabic for a Muslim shop. And, it's one of those things where the same technology is remarkably accommodatable, whatever, to a number of different ideological perspectives. And you cannot tell somebody's religion, for example, simply by looking at their level of infrastructural, sort of technological, whatever they're using, right? I don't want to say their infrastructural advancement, because that's not it. you actually, like I said, you get a higher standard of living and better returns if you're not bringing in the energy wasting version of it. And I think that's the biggest shock to most readers of Greer, or maybe most people who come to a place like India, is just how much diversity there actually is that you can have at the level of thought when you're using exactly the same technology.
And yeah, and you know, while Retrotopia has a distinctively American feel, I mean, it's basically a mix of modern progressive social sensibilities and with older American economic and legislative forms. But you can extrapolate from this really varied system that Greer imagines many other possibilities. And you know, the basic message is that we can go as far as our imaginations can take us, you know, within certain limits, certain, you know, like limits in terms of natural resources, certain logical limits, and also, you know, principled self-imposed limits. But aside from that, we can imagine an Indian retrotopia, we can imagine a Chinese retrotopia, a French retrotopia. Yeah, I think that's one of the achievements of this book is that he's really opening up the imagination to all these different configurations.
Yeah, and I was actually thinking about that when I was finishing it up, because when I started reading it, when it was originally just published on his blog back in like 2015, I think was the year, I was totally just thinking in terms of America, because I didn't know at that time I was going to be living in India. But actually, when I finished reading it today, I was thinking like, okay, so that's America in 2065. What's India going to look like? It's a really interesting, like, open question, you know, because the world is not going to follow just one path, you know, like we've gotten used to thinking about in those terms lately, where, you know, an innovation in the iPhone or in some Android phone is going to be, you know, felt all over the world by users of these one technology. But, you know, the way that the world usually develops is really unique to each region. And India in 2065, I mean, I will say this, it's probably not going to be as different from today as America certainly will be, because in a lot of ways, the way we do things here in India is actually pretty sustainable.
Yeah. So one other thing, I guess, you know, to maybe think about the potential limitations or flaws or some of the unanswered questions of this novel. So, you know, in the United States, you have a partition, and you have, you know, one of the republics in the South is the Confederate States of America. And so whenever you talk about partition and separation, especially in a US context, you know, a discussion about segregation, I think, seems unavoidable. And so, you know, Greer society is multicultural, multiracial, but you're kind of left wondering what race relations look like elsewhere. And then the other question is that, you know, in a world where you can achieve relative self-sufficiency, well, then what about, because you have Amish communities, you have, and you also have millionaires, and you have capitalism existing side by side, but what about other kinds of self-segregation? You know, what if people want to organize themselves in a way that the majority would find morally reprehensible, but that didn't directly affect them? So what about segregation, not just along religious lines, but along racial lines or ethnic lines or even linguistic lines? You can't discount the possibility that people are going to revert to those older forms either. But I guess from a modern perspective, that seems like, even, you know, for me personally, I don't want to revert back to a caste system. You know, so it's, I mean, it's a very concrete, you know, economic problem in our situation, because we live in a situation of forced interdependence, where, you know, you have a global economy and mass culture and global infrastructure. But what about in a tier system like like Greer's? What about people creating a caste system or a system of arranged marriages, genital mutilation? How I was thinking, either you have war as a way of resolving antagonisms, or you basically have to let go of the idea of humanity as this monolithic thing that you are at once a part of and also ultimately accountable to and also responsible for. So, I was wondering what you thought about that. I just, you're going to have this breakdown. You're going to have this variety of different social forms. But what about the ones that we find undesirable to be, from a modern perspective, completely undesirable?
Yeah, I think that one thing which he mentioned around the time that he wrote this that maybe is easy to miss is how in Cumberland, Maryland, where he wrote this piece, which is kind of a old Rust Belt town in Appalachia that used to have manufacturing, but it lost its manufacturing sector. And I think getting to write in that context gave him a sense of, Lakeland Republic is kind of a little further west of where he was living at that time, which had already seen this devastation from losing manufacturing, which I think there's a piece, there's a part at the beginning where they're riding the train through the Rust Belt and you see the ruins and everything, right? Yeah. That was where he was living at the time, was that, which we don't need to move to the future to see that devastation is already, we already have ruins in the Rust Belt. He talks about riding the train through like the forest and seeing abandoned factories that look like Mayan ruins in the jungle, is what he said. But one thing which maybe living in Cumberland also showed him was that the Trump movement, which he saw as sort of ground zero there in the Rust Belt, and he had a more objective view of it than if he was in Washington, D.C., or if he was in Berkeley, or if he was in Manhattan, or if he was in some cultural center where the Trump movement was this unthinkable thing which was just going on over there, right? The talking heads on CNN, to the extent that they understood the Trump movement, it was just this thing going on over there, somewhere deep in flyover country that they've never been. That was just always out there on the frontier. But John Michael Greer was living out there where this was taking shape. And one thing he mentioned was the Trump movement started in the poor half of the town. And it was a poor half of town where you saw the Trump signs go up in the front yards of the houses, but it was not a white or a black thing. It was a part of town where you saw regularly people mixing from different, I guess, racial backgrounds or whatever, because I guess the economic situation had created a link of solidarity among these people, which was simply unaccounted for by the media, who was only focused on the issue of race, and which older models that might have been more meaningful to divide people in past times were simply inapplicable to what was going on at that time. And that's the thing that the media really missed, was at least where he was living, political movements were actually transcending ethnic categories, because in a certain sense, if you were equally, I guess, screwed by the policies that led to that town going into decline, there was a whole new sort of category of political community which was taking form, which I think it's the beginning of a trend which you're going to see continue to develop.
So solidarity around economic issues and
yeah,
right.
Basically, because I was working also at a truck stop in Denver before I came here to India, and a truck stop is a kind of place which I guess you would normally not think of as being of having a lot of diversity, but it really did. This truck stop, we had Native American, African American, Asian American, Hispanic American. It didn't matter. We had lots of different. I will say there was a lot more diversity in a place like a truck stop than there was in, say, a PhD program at an R1 institution. Okay, that's the kind of place where, from my own experience, your PhD department at an R1 institution, you're seeking out diversity to maybe have somebody from the Middle East represent the Middle Eastern perspective, or you might have a tenured faculty member from Iran or from Pakistan to represent that perspective. So you're seeking out diversity, quite frankly. But honestly, overall, there's not the kind of diversity in an area of privilege that you would see out there in the parts of society that have been left behind to try to make something work in the aftermath of these policies, which have resulted in factories being closed down. So it was remarkable how much more diversity there actually was at something like a truck stop, which was, you know, all of the people who'd been left behind by the economy, myself included. And I think that fact is something which is going to become more and more felt as time goes on, is just how many people, regardless of background, got left behind into the same sort of position, and just how many more of them there are than the handful of people who continue to have these positions of privilege.
Right. And I guess also, you know, for the people who do want to organize themselves along, you know, along lines that would make me and you and other people uncomfortable, I guess, is, again, letting go of this idea of, just as, you know, we shouldn't think about technology as this monolithic thing, maybe we also shouldn't think about humanity as this monolithic thing that we're accountable to and responsible for. Because if you live in a system where, you know, self-sufficiency is possible, you know, and you don't live in a globalized culture, are you accountable to every human being on Earth, and are they accountable to you? I mean, it's an interesting question.
Right, and as much as some people might say that they do care about the whole world, and, you know, they do care about, you know, the poorest of the poor in very, very remote corners of the globe they've never been to, the fact of the matter is that's just rhetoric. Honestly, you know, there's a great inverse relation between how many people you know and how much you can care about them. You can only really care a lot about a small group of people who are close to you, in the sense that you do see them all the time. Family, friends, you know, colleagues, things like that. It's a small number.
I believe it's, I believe in the social sciences or anthropology, it's referred to as Dunbar's number. And I think the number is like 150 people, though you can't conceptualize a community larger than about 150 to 200 people. So
I've heard that number too. I try to think of the same study that you are, and those are acquaintances. You can really know about 150 acquaintances, and they do matter to you at some level. Certainly more than the billions of people on the earth that you can't really care about. But as far as close relations go, close friends, things like that, I've heard any number between 6 and 12.
Yeah,
you know, yeah, and I mean over a lifetime.
Yeah, basically, yeah, and that's an interesting question. Like, Greer, yeah, I mean, what about that? That's also another thing. What about reversion to families being the basic economic structure over anything else? That's also a possibility that, you know, we can consider as well. The return of the family.
And it's going to be a necessity. You know, that's kind of politically incorrect to say. Maybe in the West, we think of family either as this optional thing, which, you know, if you want to, you can pursue it, or maybe as this kind of oppressive structure from the past. You know, like we've been liberated from the old patriarchal family ties. But, you know, the thing about it is, that's a luxury of having abundant fossil fuels, the kind of independence you have in the West, where it's just normal for an elderly person to take their house and sell it in order to buy a condo, to move to Florida, which they'll live in until they die, and then they'll sell the condo, and I guess the children will split up the inheritance from selling the condo. That's normal in America. But, you know, Dmitry Orlov, who's actually from Russia, which has a different view on family, based on many generations of, I guess, maybe finding out the hard way what benefit there actually is from having family connections. He talks about it differently. He says that the sensible thing to do from an old Russian perspective would not be to sell that house and then buy a condo in Florida that you live in for 10 years. It would be to pass that house on to somebody in the family, because that way you don't have to go into debt to buy another one. But we don't think that way anymore. We think, the parents got to sell their house to buy a condo, and then every kid has to take out a $500,000 mortgage to buy their own house. And every one of them is deep in debt, but it's just normal. But it's really not normal. It's not normal to pursue going into debt so thoughtlessly when you could have ways to avoid it.
As moving out at the age of 18 and as a rite of passage where you establish yourself as an independent individual, that's only a thing in America. That's not the case in my own culture, in Nepali culture, and very well that's not how the Indian mindset works either. You don't just move out at the age of 18, and which is really you're basically abandoning your family and then dressing it up as a rite of passage about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and all that rhetoric.
And what do you actually gain by doing it? I mean, you're right. In India, if you're not married, say by the age, if you're not married by the age of 30, you're still living with your parents until you're married off. It's not a matter of just going out and getting your apartment with your 5 friends or whatever at 18 years old, like it is in America. But what's the question is like, what do you actually gain from going through this rite of passage? Because I did it at 18 years old. I went off to college and lived in the dorm, and I did it with student loans. And I kind of played at getting independent, but I wasn't really, because I was dependent on debt to do it. And if I had gone on to get a mortgage afterwards, I would have also been playing at independence by going deeper into debt. And the thing is, like, when you have the kind of individualistic culture we have in America, where everybody has to get their own house, their own mortgage, their own apartment, their own whatever, and they can only do it by going deep in debt, because the cost is so exorbitant. In India, you can routinely see like 10 people in a household. Like this house that I'm in right now, maybe we don't have 10 people living here constantly, but we certainly have, aunts and uncles and cousins and grandmother and all kinds of different, me and my wife, and all of these people who maybe don't live here permanently, but we come here and we live here part of the time. And the house really oftentimes has about 10 people in it. And it would be unthinkable in America, but it functions much better, because so many of the things which you have to pay a ton of money to pay somebody else to do, you have to pay a stranger to do it for you. If you have 10 people in a house, you can actually just have a lot of that done by somebody within the family. You can have house cleaning kind of chores shifted around between different people. You can have cooking done by different people. You can have, basic healthcare or care providing for people done by people within the family. And it's simply a much, much more sensible way to get things done that costs less money and gives you better results.
Yeah, and what you mean when you say independence or being independent in the U.S. is basically, alienation from your family and total dependence on the economy, on impersonal institutions for healthcare, to make a wage, and all of these things. And you can't really have. Yeah.
Well, not to mention childcare in Denver. Childcare, daycare, $1,500 a month, which in India that would just be done by a family member,
grandparents.
Right. And how many times are you getting subpar daycare in America anyway for that kind of money, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Okay. So Chad, one of the last things that I wanted to touch on, I mentioned this before we came on live, is you did a recent, you've done a few videos on Kaczynski's theories regarding technology. So if you'll indulge me, I wanted to use your recent lecture on the relationship between social forms and objective factors to talk about, Greer's vision in Retrotopia.
Yeah, that'd be interesting. What are you thinking of?
Yeah, so just to give a little bit of background, so objective factors is basically a way of talking about the fact that social forms don't spread and take hold due, to like the consistency or the validity of the ideology that they embody. It's rather that certain underlying factors create the conditions allowing for a particular social form to flourish. And that's why the example that you mentioned of, democracy took so long to actually become widespread, even though it was available as an idea since ancient times. It's only widespread now because there are certain underlying conditions that allow it to be implemented efficiently. And so in that video, you distinguished between three thinkers and their perspective on what actually is the objective factors. And so you deal with the vision of Marx, Kaczynski, and also Greer. And so to just give a brief summation, so for Marx is the objective factor entails the ownership of the means of production. So for him, the question is which class has control over the material conditions. And that includes the wealth that's concentrated in technological infrastructure. And then for Kaczynski, it's technology itself that's the underlying factor. And what you get from that is, what we talked about before, an understanding. You get from that the concept of technological autonomy, which is the idea that complex, he uses the term organization-dependent systems. They have their own inertia and they have their own direction that's beyond rational control. And then lastly, with Greer, all industrial activity presupposes the continued burning of fossil fuels. So for Greer, oil is the foundation without which technology couldn't function. And so what I found interesting is that in Retrotopia, within the tier system of the Lakeland Republic, you have a stock market, and millionaires, and you have small businesses. You have all the things that you would associate with capitalism. And then you have religious agrarian communalism, right? Even more Luddite than the Amish, and you also have the Amish there as well. But horizontal industrial organization, the socialist ideal of worker-owned and worker-run factories, that's absent. And also the wilderness, the hunter-gatherer subsistence conditions that Kaczynski favors, those are both, I would say, conspicuously absent. And so I guess I wanted to spend a little bit of time exploring the idea that what these thinkers identified to be the underlying objective factors is kind of determining their conception of political freedom and what constitutes political emancipation. So, if you see ownership of material conditions as the objective factor, then, with Marx, you imagine radical change as a shift in political power, and you see no need to critique infrastructure as such. If I recall, in the Communist Manifesto, Marx actually praises the innovative capacity of the innovative and the revolutionizing capacity of capitalism. And then with Greer, again, if you see oil as the objective factor, then you can imagine all kinds of social configurations that do without it, while allowing for unequal power and unequal ownership that somebody like Marx would object to. And so Greer, and Greer is also not making the kind of, I think, moral critique that Kaczynski is making, where Kaczynski really sees an inverse relationship between the growth of technology, of all technologies, or at least things that are infrastructural technologies, organization-dependent technologies, an inverse relationship between the growth of that and human freedom and dignity. So, so it's very interesting. I'm trying to work through Greer's vision through that lecture that you gave, because for him, there's no inherent problem with technologies if their real costs, both social and environmental, are accounted and paid for. And so the one line principle that summarizes this, that's repeated throughout the novel, is no one's technology gets a subsidy. So large scale organization-dependent technologies like electricity and streetcars that need running electricity, they're acceptable, but they're limited to the municipal level, where the costs are translated directly into the level of taxes. And so I guess this is like somewhat of a challenge to the Kaczynski's idea of technological autonomy. So, I mean, he's arguing that each particular instantiation of technology could be a conscious choice and within rational control if you remove the objective factor of oil. So, yeah, and then we can choose between historical alternatives. We can pick and choose, historical examples of technology, and create all kinds of combinations. Again, but Kaczynski, if you see technology as the objective factor, then a shift from any artificial structure towards the wilderness, that becomes the ideal. And so, it's interesting. He's really not, his critique is non-moral, and he's not condemning technology as such. So, yeah,
you mean Greer is not condemning it because his stance on technology is not a moral one of whether it's morally wrong to use it. It's just a question largely of, can you pay for it, right?
Right, exactly. And so I don't know how to make sense of that. Something feels I agree with you that oil is the objective factor, but I don't know if, but totally letting go of the moral critique is it's strange. I don't think that's completely satisfactory either. I agree with you. Marx's analysis is limited because he doesn't see that all of this infrastructure is running on oil.
Well, if you think about the places in the world where Marxism was turned into an actual system that ran a country, they all had to pay for it some way. It's not a coincidence that the Soviet Union fell 3 years after Russia hit peak oil. Okay, so if you want proof of the theory of peak oil, look for the fact that the Soviet Union fell 3 years after it hit peak oil. And the global recession of 2008 was 3 years after 2005, which was 3 years after the world hit peak oil. And our manufacturing sector was destroyed during the late 70s. I don't know if that was 3 years after, it's like my battery is not dead. Let me just plug this in.
Okay.
Let me just grab a charger real quick. So to exemplify, what I was talking about, at some point it has to pay for itself, okay? And in the case of this laptop, I can use it on condition that somehow the energy is getting to it for me to use it. And communism had to pay for itself some way, okay? And it was not self-sufficient. The Soviets were dependent on oil, and the recovery of Russia after the 90s was largely due to the fact that they still had pretty good oil reserves there. And Putin is using those largely for political purposes, because Russia kind of owns the oil resources as a country, rather than having private businesses own them as companies make profit. Okay, so that's the wise thing to do in Russia, I guess, but they have to pay for it. And Fidel Castro in Cuba had to pay for the system, and he largely did it with sugar. He could never get away from needing sugar to be the source of cash to run that society. And that's the fact which you always run into when you go from Marxism as a reactive critique of capitalism, which is easy. I mean, I did that for years. I was a card-carrying Marxist for years, because it's easy to use those resources to make an angry critique of what's wrong with capitalism. But when you go from critique to actually like running a country, you have to pay for it some way. And what Marx misses is that the thing that's paying for that system to go on in the first place is something which his analysis largely can't account for, because it's deeper than just the dialectical mediation of modes of production and modes of ownership and all of the other terminology that you get from Marx. And if you don't have the oil, none of it for the Soviets, none of it mattered. And without the sugar, Fidel Castro would not have been able to keep Cuba together as long as he has, or whoever his successor is now. And I think that if nothing else, that's what I take from this, is that at some point the system has to pay for itself, and this is what Kaczynski also misses: is technology has to pay for itself. This laptop, the energy has to come from somewhere to power it, and if you're missing the what of what's paying for the system, whether that be oil or sugar or another sort of hard current or hard asset that you're actually running the society on, you're going to miss the point, I think. I mean, I feel like maybe I'm missing something of what you were getting at.
No, yeah, I agree with that analysis completely. I guess what I was trying to get at was that it seems like there are value judgments that are attached to choosing what to identify as the objective factor. Or I guess what I'm saying is, yeah, it seems like that's what's determining their conception of political freedom, right? Because, and that's why I pointed out the fact that in Retrotopia, Greer's vision has all this variety, and you have agrarian communalism, but you don't have industrial communalism. You don't have worker-run factories, and you also don't. There's no talk about the wilderness, Kaczynski's vision. So I guess what I was trying to say was, does identifying one thing as the objective factor over another kind of preclude certain other possibilities, I guess is what I'm trying to get at. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that the moral factor certainly that is present in like the Marxist critique is that you definitely do have this moral sense of capitalism as an evil and communism as a good, which is framed in this kind of religious terminology about, the capitalist isn't just stupid who's doing something that's not, smart. It's just evil, right? You actually have the evil sense of, in a moralistic sense, that they're doing something wrong by doing capitalism. Just like for Kaczynski, you do have this sense that the engineer or the scientist who's developing new technologies isn't just a stupid person who's ignorant to the facts which Kaczynski could show him. No, he had a sense that they were doing something evil. That's why he killed them. and allegedly, right? And the Marxists too, you know, they did kill the capitalists, just like the French Enlightenment people did kill the aristocrats, and that's what you do if you identify someone as pure evil. And it's what you're starting to see in America too. You have politically motivated killings on both the right and the left. You have the guy who went to a baseball game and shot a congressman because he was from a different political party. You know, you're starting to see these political killings in America too, and that's what happens when you frame it in moral terms, where the other person isn't stupid, they're evil. And what do you do with evil people? Is you fight them. It's okay, because you know they're not evaluated by the same standards that you would give to a person who's not evil. And is that really present in peak oil? I mean, that's a good question. I mean, you're right. It's there in Marxism, where the capitalist is evil. It's there in Kaczynski, where the technophile is evil. Is the oil person evil in peak oil, in the peak oil subculture? Or are they just wrong? I don't know. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah. So I guess, I mean, the question that I was trying to ask myself while reading this, well, you know, okay, so Greer has religious communalism. He has agrarian, you know, religious societies that are organized, that like I think the New Shakers is one of the groups that he mentions, which are like the Amish, but they don't have, it's completely collective ownership. And you have markets, you have a stock market, you have small businesses, but you don't have, you know, worker-run factories or worker-owned, worker-run factories. I was wondering if that was a conscious choice on Greer's part to exclude like the socialist vision. Does he see that as completely irreconcilable with his varied tier system? And also, what about Kaczynski's vision? Where is the wilderness in Greer's vision? This, you know, conditions that really cannot be controlled, conditions that are not subject to any kind of rational control. Both of those things are conspicuously absent. And so I guess I was trying to make a connection to maybe it's what you identify as the objective factor determines what the range of possibilities that you think about.
Oh yeah, I think that's a great point. I will say this, in other writings by Greer, he does talk about communism, and he does talk about hunter-gatherer lifestyles. And what he says about Capital is, he says, Capital is an interesting book, which should be treated like Mein Kampf. So, you know, don't burn it. I mean, keep it on archive, but it's not a viable, in his words, you know, it's not a viable vision that somebody should be implementing as a serious contender, because he said that the body count from that book is just, nobody else is comparable. Like no ideology has killed as many people as communism. You know, if you, the viewer, don't believe me, just look up, you know, Stalin, Mao. I mean, there's no comparison, and they were not the only ones either. I know that, like, my first channel, I had a lot of Marxists watching because that's what I was at the time. But I mean, it's just irrefutable evidence that, you know, the body count. Yeah.
Funny thing, it's not. Sorry to interrupt. So
go ahead.
It's funny, like, you know, I actually dress this way in my daily life as well. I pretty much wear the same articles of clothing every day. And it's funny, in college, everyone that I came across immediately assumed that I was either a Trotskyist or a Marxist-Leninist, just because I you know, of the way I dress. And I keep trying to, and so this is for anybody watching. My style of dress is not a nod to Stalinists or Marxist-Leninists. it's a nod to the jazz world.
Right, that's what I was thinking. I certainly didn't think that you were a communist. I just thought that's the jazz sort of musician look of you know, a great musician. So, and definitely, we have our communists here in India too, which I think it's more of a mainstream party in India. But, you know, it's definitely something which, you've also got a body count here in India, because on a regular basis, you have Maoist terrorist acts in India.
Yeah.
They're,
I think they're called Naxalites. I believe the Maoists in India are called Naxalites.
I think so.
Naxalites, yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Well, in the Indian newspaper on a regular basis, you'll see like, you know, Maoist kills 2 police officers, or there's a bombing or something like that. And, you know, that's not a contradiction of, you know, it's not that, you know, the Maoist ideology is a peaceful ideology, which these are just bad apples. No, it really does mandate that violence. And that's okay, you know, if that's your ideology, except for the fact that that's not going to build anything. It's ultimately just going to be a drain on whatever energy source is powering it. And in the case of Russia, that was oil. In the case of Fidel Castro, that's sugar. In the case of China, you could argue that it's a number of factors that they're using to build this manufacturing giant, which involves all kinds of rare earth minerals being, you know, used up that we won't have in the future to manufacture new iPhones. We're using them up. And China has a monopoly on almost all of the rare earth minerals for high-tech manufacturing. And, you know, they can do that for now. But if they did not have this manufacturing capacity, you would not see the communist vision stay alive in China. And, you know, I think that the day when that comes to an end is going to be sooner than most people think.
Yeah. Yeah, I have to say, I mean, Greer, this is, again, it's a very important book. I'm really glad you suggested it to me. And it's really refreshing, this, you know, non-moral critique of technology, like the things that he lists, like, so, I mean, he's not a technological determinist, as we've, you know, established. And that's also kind of unthinkable in both Marx and in Kaczynski, is they don't talk about, you know, that, you know, we could have a situation where instead of technology determining cultural development, you can have cultural limits on technological expansion. And like, just to give an example, you know, so the protagonist is walking around the city and he notices that there are businesses with ads all over the place, but there are no ads on, there are no billboards, there's no ads on the streetcar system. And so this kind of now is unthinkable for us, like the idea that you can have newspapers and printing but no internet. You can have marketing and advertising, but you can limit ads to storefronts of small businesses. And you can avoid the situation that we have now, especially, you know, where I am in New York City, where public space is basically, it's a euphemism for, you know, vast catalogs of cheap products and services. And I guess a Marxist or even a Kaczynskiite would probably resist this idea that one thing need not necessarily lead to this extreme. So that's really, really interesting.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, in addition, maybe, you know, great points you bring up, the question of, you know, going back to the woods, which is missing in the analysis of John Michael Greer, as you mentioned. I do recall in 2009, the book Long Descent, he mentions the fantasy, I guess, as he calls it, of reacting to the fall of industrial civilization by going into the woods with, you know, some garden seeds that you bought at Home Depot, and surviving, as he says, if the apocalypse ever comes, we're going to find a lot of skeletons with, you know, Home Depot seeds nearby, because it's not going to work. And you know, the fact of the matter is that he says himself that if you don't have experience as a hunter or gatherer, if you go into the woods, you're either going to be facing death, or you're going to be facing a very primitive lifestyle. It's not the kind of thing which most people can just go into the forest and have a viable existence. Now, Ted Kaczynski was different because he was unusually motivated to do it. He was exceptionally motivated to try to live that life, and he studied the scientific materials to do it the right way, because he noted that's a lot of edible plants are dangerous to even experiment with, because some of them are deadly poisons, but some of them are not. So he was unusually, I think, also educated in what he was doing. He didn't just go out there and, like, eat whatever he saw growing. He did a lot of very good scientific research to do it the right way. But he's a very exceptional case, which most people, unless they were raised as hunter-gatherers, most people are not going to react that way. And I want to mention one other thing, which Kaczynski himself noted, was that there was a tribe of hunter-gatherers in like Africa who would occasionally intermarry with a tribe of agrarian farmers. And if there was a marriage between the two, it was very rare for the child to become a hunter-gatherer. Oftentimes, if the child was able to be raised as an agrarian person with a more stable existence, they would take that path. It's very rare in life for somebody to actually not give in to the extra convenience of not being a hunter-gatherer.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. People, I think his return to nature, Kaczynski's that is really, was only possible because of his staggering, the staggering intellect that he possessed. I mean, most of the things that hunter-gatherers do, we just cannot do. They do it intuitively. They do it, just as a matter of reflex. Whereas, and someone who's not approaching their world systematically and learning about each thing separately at a time is not going to be able to adjust to that way of life, because it would take so much more energy. You have to strain your mental capacities to put yourself in that worldview.
Right, and it is actually outright dangerous in many cases, because my mother was from South Korea. In the 1950s, she lived in a mud hut and worked in a rice paddy. She was basically living an agrarian, peasant lifestyle in Korea. And there were still a lot of old traditions about finding things in the wild that were good to eat. You would take wild dandelions and you would make very good, kimchi and things like that. But she said that when she was young in Korea, there were still people who would occasionally pick the wrong wild mushroom and they would die. Because even though it was still, these were not suburban dwellers with no background in foraging. They were people, who were still pretty competent at it. It was still dangerous enough that if you got the wrong mushroom, you could die.
Wow. Yeah. It's there's so many factors that, we can't just say, oh, we'll be able to intuitively determine how to eat and we'll just revert back to animal instincts. It's not as simple as that. We have to live with all this cultural conditioning, that would get in the way of being in the wild. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that you could see something like an agrarian revolution. You could see people establish stable settlements where they grow barley and they grow wheat and they grow potatoes and they keep pigs and sheep. You could see that, because that's a lot less risky than going into the forest. And I live, near like some forest in India, and the rule of thumb is you don't go out at night. I think this is in The Hobbit too. No, The Lord of the Rings. Okay, in The Lord of the Rings, you might remember there's the part where Frodo and his friends decide to go through the forest at night. They decide to go through the forest for like several days, and one of the hobbits says, I've only been during the day because nobody goes in that forest at night. And that's kind of an old piece of wisdom, which we still have here, is I wanted to go out to burn some trash outside, and my wife told me, you never go near the forest at night because you don't know what's going to be out there. And the thing about India is it's a whole different place at night. I told you that 1 a.m, I stepped into the kitchen and I was putting away some potatoes and I heard something move in the room, and it was a rat, a huge rat. It leapt through the window that was just left open a little bit. It leapt through the window and escaped when I came in, And that's when the shrews come out, and that's when you see like everything's different at nighttime. And the thing is, if you're a hunter-gatherer, you're living in that forest day and night. You know, you don't just go into it to harvest grains and then go back to your settlement. You're kind of living in that environment day and night. And I mean, people have done that, but it would be quite a leap for your average suburban dweller today, or your average Manhattanite, you know, to go into that pretty overnight, right?
Yeah, it will be interesting to see how some of the people who think they're preparing this stuff by, you know, hunting on the weekend are going to fare in a truly feral situation, you know, post collapse. I think that there will be some of it. I think there will be some communities. I think especially if people rely on already existing hunter-gatherer communities. I mean, I could foresee a situation where people decide to go join already existing communities that are living in that way, and then that lifestyle slowly expanding outward, but without an established base for how to learn about that or immerse yourself in that life. Yeah, it's not a viable alternative at this point.
I mean, I don't know how it was in New York when you were growing up, but in Colorado, that's a state where a lot of people go camping, and a lot of people from other states will move to Colorado because of, you know, the great camping scene in the forest and the mountains, whatever. But like, I still remember as a kid, a lot of people, for them, going camping meant getting into an RV and driving to the woods and staying in your RV for a weekend, right?
Right, and lighting fires with kerosene and eating marshmallows. Yeah, that's not a feral existence.
Right, and you would get hot dogs or hamburgers from Walmart, and you would go out to the woods, and you would have a little. And for a lot of them, it was just a drinking trip, you know, because like in Colorado, the joke is, if your husband, you know, says he's going on a hunting trip, he really means he's going on a trip.
He's going on a what?
A drinking. He's going on a drinking trip. He's just going to drink the beer in the woods with his buddies, you know.
Right. Cool. Yeah. So, did you have any other points that you wanted to raise?
I think we covered a lot. It was a great discussion. I enjoyed this, and I think that, you know, talking to you really kind of helps me, you know, think about things I haven't ever thought about. That was very enlightening to think about, you know, the kind of questions you were posing, and you know, your perspectives in general. And I really enjoyed getting to talk about this book. So yeah, definitely. Thank you. I know that I don't even know what time it is. I think we've been talking for a while now. Oh wow, it's already almost 6 o'clock. So yeah, we talked for quite a while. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, yeah. You know, I get exactly that, you know, the same benefits, maybe even more, by talking to you. You know, and I say this not to impose on you. It's just the way that I view your content. You could tell, like, I'm trying to relate this stuff to a lot of the lectures that you have on your channel. I really do see you as, you know, as one of my primary teachers. You know, and I really appreciate not just the quality and the depth of your presentations, but also the, you know, what's really, really, really lacking on the internet is any degree of civility. I mean, the internet culture is a degenerate culture that lacks any civility or sense of respect. And it's really great to be able to engage with you. I mean, you know, I would engage you the same way. If you were in my daily life, you know, we would have this conversation in my home. So that's one of the things that I appreciate about getting to have these dialogues with you. You know, I think that's just as important, maybe even more important than all of these different ideas that I get to try to explore.
Oh, well, thank you. And it's a great pleasure to be able to have these discussions. I think that the internet is one of those things which, I mean, you know, I critique technology all the time, but right now we actually do have this amazing opportunity to use the internet for good purposes, and nobody's doing it. You know,
everybody's squandering it.
We're squandering it. We're squandering it with flame wars, right, which are something which there's actually forums specifically just for flaming. And I mean, it's just we're squandering a once in a lifetime of the universe basically situation where all of this highly expensive, sophisticated infrastructure is just completely freely available to us, and it won't last forever. But you know, right now we have the opportunity to be having these discussions, and it's just great that we're able to do that. I mean, I feel very fortunate that you know. It's not just getting to make maybe lectures in a one-sided way. It's the discussion too that with people like you. It's a great thing. I'm very fortunate that things have turned out this way. That I'm able to be a part of it.
Yeah, likewise, absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you so much, and I know that I took a lot of time, but thank you for joining, and certainly. We'll be in touch about maybe doing another video on another topic which we can sort of think about over time. And I'll just go ahead and invite you to that. And you know, once again, thanks for a good discussion.
Thank you, Chad.
All right. Well, take care. We'll see you the next time.
All right.